Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar held as part of the VMIA Practitioner Education Series. I'm Luke Hamblin, Team Leader of the Technical and Regulation Building Team, and I'll be your host today. Please note, we are running a hybrid webinar today that includes live streaming of learning content with interactive polls and live Q&As answered by our technical team. I encourage you all to please type your questions into the Q&A chat function during the live streaming and also to participate in the interactive polls. Today's webinar is about livable housing as per the NCC 2022. As you may be aware, the ABCB included livable housing into the 2022 NCC. Due to significant change and impact of this amendment, the VBA pushed to have this implementation of the section of the code move back to the start date of the 1st of May 2024 for Victoria. Our aim in this webinar is to provide some clarity and interpretation around the inclusion of the livable housing section of the code as implemented by the ABCB. It's a significant change. There's going to be lots of questions. Anything we aren't able to answer today, we'll take offline and get back to you. But I hope you enjoy this webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending the session today. Today, you'll be hearing from Adam Kakmak. Adam is a qualified building surveyor who's part of our technical and regulation building team at the VBA. He has over 10 years building surveying experience in both residential and commercial sectors in Victoria. Adam has experience in building permit approvals and associated regulatory compliance requirements. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, the VBA is committed to ensuring a safe, confident and thriving industry and collaborate with stakeholders to enhance practitioner capability and conduct and protect our consumer interests. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understand how to do things correctly, maintaining integrity of the building and plumbing industries. Today's webinar will be about livable housing as per the NCC 2022. Now, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded and the link to this presentation will be made available on the VBA website along with our previous webinars. During the webinar, we will be conducting live interactive polls that will be automatically appear on your screens. Please participate in these. Links to other relevant websites will appear and some slides as QR codes. Please feel free to scan the QR code with your phone when they appear on the slides to direct you to the relevant websites relating to the topic being presented today. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can during the webinar. However, we receive a large volume of questions. We may not be able to have time to answer them all during the webinar. After this webinar, we'll collate all the unanswered questions and we'll provide an answer to as many of these as possible. A copy of these questions will then be circulated around in the coming weeks following the webinar. Adam, I'll now hand over to you.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for the introduction. So as Luke mentioned, this presentation is recorded and for the purposes of our webinar, we will discuss a number of commonly asked questions and review the requirements relating to the respective parts of the Livable design standard. As mentioned by Luke, one of the primary aims of our webinars is to help increase practitioner awareness on the standard. We will do this by setting out the required technical building requirements that allow dwellings to meet the standard. And through the application of the standard, we can attempt to better meet the needs of the community, including older Australians and for those with mobility limitations. So our webinar will cover the following specific topics, which I'll begin with the application of the Livable Housing Design Standard, including the applicable building classes. Then I'll move on to the dwelling access requirements. Then the following part will cover the dwelling entrance requirements, then the internal door and corridor requirements, before I proceed to the respective sanitary compartment requirements. And then lastly, I'll move on to the part that talks about the reinforcement of bathroom and sanitary compartment wall requirements. So let's begin by confirming that for Victoria, the Livable Housing Design Standard comes into effect on the 1st of May 2024. And as mentioned, the standard aims to provide the construction and design requirements to allow dwellings to meet the access requirements for everybody, including the young, the old, and with mobility disabilities. Firstly, the standard applies to all Class 1 residential dwellings, and in Victoria, it also applies to any proposed new small second dwelling situated on the same allotment alongside a new or existing residential dwelling. If you would like to find out more on the requirements related to a new small second dwelling, please refer to the QR code shown on the screen. In addition, the standard only applies to the internal parts of a Class 2 sole occupancy unit, and it does not include the common parts of a Class 2 building. In addition, it also does not apply to the differing access requirements already addressed by NCC Volume 1 of the Building Code of Australia. In respect to Volume 1, practitioners are required to apply the requirements under the Disability Access to Premises Building Standards 2010, Part D4, Access for People with a Disability, and Australian Standard 1428. Here is a short animated video to take you through the fundamentals regarding dwelling access.
What does the ABCB Livable Housing Design Standard require in regards to dwelling access?
Great question. It requires a continuous step-free access path to the dwelling entrance from 1. The allotment boundary. 2. An appurtenant garage or carport. 3. A car parking space within the allotment provided for the exclusive use of the dwelling occupants.
Now that our video has covered the application, let's move on to the specific requirements relating to dwelling access. To reiterate, the standard requires a continuous step-free access path to the dwelling entrance. That includes from the pedestrian entry at the allotment boundary, or an appurtenant Class 10A garage or carport, or a car parking space provided for the exclusive use of the occupants of the dwelling. And it must be remembered that at least one level and step-free entrance door into the dwelling from the access path must be provided. Let's move on to the pathway to entrance doorway. Here's an example shown on the screen. The requirements that apply to a dwelling on entrance doorway, in summary, must be as follows. It must have no steps. It must have a maximum gradient of 1 in 14 in the direction of travel. It must have a minimum width of 1 meter, and the allocated pathway must connect to a dwelling entrance door. Or alternatively, the pathway can be provided directly from the garage via an entrance door, or from the carport to the dwelling entrance door, or from the designated car parking space. It should be remembered that any gates provided on the access pathway must have a clear opening of 820 millimeters. In addition, where an access path incorporates a section that's elevated or suspended above the finished ground, the dead and live load requirements must meet the structural provisions of Australian Standard 1170 Part 1. In summary, the key principle for outside the dwelling is to have an easy access path to the dwelling entrance door. Moving on to the requirements for a step-free access path from the garage or carport or a car parking space for the exclusive use of the occupants. These alternatives require a step-free access path, which must have the following. It must have a connection between the dwelling entrance door and the car parking space. It must be step-free. It must be a minimum of 1 meter wide. It must have a crossfall of 1 in 40 or shallower. And similar to before, if any gates are located on the access path, those gates must have a minimum clear opening width of 820 mm. Just an alert for everyone in regard to the use of the garage as the direct access path. It should be noted where the space required for step-free access intrudes into the minimum required space for car parking under the siding provisions, a report and consent may be required under the building regulations. Please refer specifically to Regulation 78 when assessing or designing the garage option. Moving on to further design examples. Where a path shallower or equal to 1 in 20 cannot be used, and in instances where one or more ramps is necessary, the ramps must comply with the following requirements. Firstly, the interval between landings must not be more than 9 meters for 1 in 14 gradient, or 15 meters in length for a 1 in 20 gradient. The other way to measure it would be by length determined by a linear interpolation for ramps with a gradient between 1 in 14 and 1 in 20. Secondly, the minimum width of the ramp must be maintained at 1 meter between any handrails or curbs if provided at each side of the ramp. Thirdly, at each end of the ramp, there must be a landing that is not less than 1200 millimeters long and at least as wide as the ramp to which it connects. And it must be level or have a gradient not more than 1 in 40 if a gradient is necessary for drainage. In this application, it should be noted that a landing area, if provided at the dwelling entry, can count as a landing for the purposes of the ramp. Lastly, where a single ramp is used, the step ramp must have a height of not more than 190 millimeters and a gradient not more than 1 in 10, and have a width of at least 1 meter or equivalent to that of the access path, whichever is the greater, and as mentioned, a maximum length of 1900 millimeters. Here on this slide are further specific examples for potential ramp designs, with single on the left and multiple ramps shown with landings on the right-hand side. It should be remembered that the standard stipulates that the start of the access ramp is the allotment boundary, and not the public footpath. The public footpath cannot be used as a landing. In addition, it should be remembered that the use of decks and boardwalk style paths needs to comply with AS 1170, AS 1684, and or any applicable NASH standard that relates to residential and low-rise steel framing. A further point of guidance to be remembered is that Part 1 of the ABCB standard for livable housing design requires a step-free access path from a parking space or property boundary to the dwelling entry door for a Class 1 dwelling. However, for Class 2 buildings, it should be remembered that NCC Volume 1 Part D4 access for people with a disability is applicable instead of the livable housing design standard. Therefore, it is not necessary to apply Part 1 of the livable housing design to a Class 2 building, as Part D4 and the appropriate Australian standard, in this case being AS 1428, address the accessibility requirements. This means that practitioners need to ensure the differing requirements are applied to Class 2 buildings. For instance, where there is a change in direction in a ramp design, Australian standard 1428 requires a clear width of 1500 millimeters instead of 1200 millimeters as specified in the livable housing design standard for Class 1 dwellings. Here's another example for the use of a dedicated car parking space with an access path. This alternative allows for one or more car parking spaces to be connected to or from part of a required access path to at least one of the car parking spaces. One of these car parking spaces must have a minimum unobstructed car parking space of 3.2 meters wide by 5.4 meters long, and have a gradient of not more than 1 in 33 for bitumen or 1 in 40 for any other surface material. This applies only when the appurtenant garage, carport, or car parking space is connected to or forms part of a required access path. Where the step-free access path is provided from an appurtenant garage or carport, access into the dwelling must be via a door complying with the entrance requirements, which are discussed in Part 2 of the Livable Design Standard. It should be noted in regard to the entry requirements that for instances where access ramps are required next to the external wall of the building, practitioners should be mindful that the ramp must be constructed with a 25mm separation from the building to meet the termite management visual inspection zone requirements. This is only applicable to buildings identified as requiring termite management. Please note, however, that this gap can be reduced provided at the point where the ramp crosses the perimeter termite management system, the system is altered to form a slab joint as specified by clause 6.3.4 of Australian Standard 3660 Part 1. Okay, there's been a lot of information that I've gone through there. Let's pause for a moment and go and have a quick quiz. So the first question is, does the standard apply to all parts of a Class 2 building? Is that true or false? The second question relates to whether a continuous step-free path to a dwelling entrance door can only be provided from the pedestrian entry at the allotment boundary. And the third question applies to where a single step ramp is used. The step ramp must have a height of not more than 190mm, a gradient not more than 1 in 10, and a width of at least 1 meter or equivalent to that of the access path, whichever is the greater, and a maximum length of 1.9 meters. So for all those that answered the questions, the answer to question 1 is that the standard only applies to the internal parts of a Class 2 building. As mentioned previously, NCC volume number 1 must be applied, and volume 1 has differing requirements to that of the Livable Housing Design Standard. Question 2 discussed whether a step-free path to a dwelling entrance door has to be provided from a pedestrian entry at the allotment boundary. The answer to that is it's false. It can also be provided from an appurtenant Class 10A garage or carport or a car parking space provided for the exclusive use of the occupants of the dwelling. And lastly, the third question in regard to single step ramp and whether it can be used, the answer was yes, it can be, as long as those requirements are met. Let's move on to discussing the specific exemptions that apply to a Class 1 dwelling and the required access requirements. These exemptions can be found under Performance Requirement H8P1 and clauses H8D2, subclause 2A and B of the volume number 2 of the BCA. When step-free access from an appurtenant garage, carport, or car parking space is not provided, clause 1.1 of the standard for step-free access need not be complied with if one or more of the following apply. The first exemption relates to whether the area for the access path is too steep, and the second exemption applies to whether there is actually insufficient space on the allotment. When access via an appurtenant garage, carport, or car parking space is not provided, NCC Volume 2, Clause H8, D2, Subclause 2A sets a prerequisite for applying any one or more of the exemption conditions. The clause indicates you cannot apply an exemption unless you can establish that step-free access is not provided from an appurtenant garage, carport, or car parking space. Some examples that allow for this are that there's no garage, carport, or car parking space proposed on the allotment site, or the garage, carport, or car parking space is on a different floor level to the rest of the dwelling, or the garage, carport, or car parking space is shared with another dwelling or building and so is not provided for the exclusive use of the occupants of the dwelling. It must be noted, however, that even if an exemption for this clause does apply, all other relevant requirements of the standard must still be complied with. In addition, if one or more of the following conditions exist, an exemption can only apply for instances where the average slope of the ground on which the access path would be constructed exceeds the maximum gradient of 1 in 14 that's required, or it provides an external step-free access path that would necessitate construction of ramping that exceeds the length and gradient allowed, or there is insufficient space available on the site on which to construct a step-free access path. And subject to the insufficient space exemption, if there is a difference in level measured vertically from the pedestrian entry at the allotment boundary or parking space to the floor level at the entrance door on the nearest floor containing habitable rooms, that would necessitate construction of ramping that exceeds the length and gradient. For the purposes of the exemptions that would necessitate excessive ramping, the difference in level must be measured from the floor level at the entrance door. If there is an attached deck, balcony, or the like that provides a step-free connection to the entrance door, this is to be measured from the lowest point of that deck or balcony or the like above the surface beneath. It should be noted that the livable housing design exemption provides for situations where the ramping necessary to provide a step-free access path would become too lengthy or too steep to be used regularly by a person with limited mobility, and therefore would offer little benefit to dwelling occupants. Such situations may occur due to a number of factors, including but limited to the following types of examples. The slope of the land upon which the ramp would be constructed. For example, if the required step-free access path cannot be provided in one continuous direction, which means it would instead need to be cut into a slope or would run backwards and forwards across the face of the slope in order for it to stay within the maximum gradient limitations. Another example may be by the height of the lowest floor containing habitable rooms, which is too high to be reached by a ramp within the required length and gradient limitations. Floor heights can be influenced by factors such as dwelling style, a defined flood level, or the location of a dwelling in an alpine area, for instance. So the construction of a dwelling directly above a private garage would also mean that the exemptions could potentially apply. To help further clarify the exemptions listed in H8D2 of the NCC, those exemptions also provide for situations where the amount of available space on the site is insufficient to accommodate a step-free access path. This, as I mentioned, may be due to the physical size of the site or regulations outside of the NCC, which limit the proportion of a site that can be covered by structures or be limited by impervious ground coverings. It is important to note that under H8D2, an exemption may only be applied if in a particular case both exemptions are applicable, not just one or the other. In conclusion, it should be noted that even if an exemption is applicable, all other requirements of the standard must still be complied with, as previously mentioned. Let's move on to the Class 2 requirements. Lastly, in this section, each apartment, as you can see on this slide, in a Class 2 building is required to comply with the standard, except for the step-free access path and the car parking space requirements incorporated into a step-free access path. The Livable Housing Design Standard, as mentioned, does not apply to the external and to the common parts of a Class 2 building. To help identify the differing requirements, this figure illustrates where National Construction Code Volume 1 Part D4 requires accessibility for common areas, and where Part G7 requires compliance with the design standard. As we can see, each apartment sole occupancy unit has an accessible floor access from a common area, and Part D4 and G7 would apply as shown by this example. Let's move on to the dwelling entrance door requirements. So firstly, the first requirement relates to having at least one entrance door to the dwelling, which must be a minimum 820 millimeters clear. The entrance door threshold must be level or have a max sill height of 5 millimeters or have a ramped threshold that does not extend beyond the depth of the door jamb. It must also have a gradient not steeper than 1 in 8, and it must be at least as wide as the minimum clear opening of the entrance door. It must also not intrude into the minimum dimensions of the required landing area. Lastly, the required entrance door must have a space of at least 1200 millimeters by 1200 millimeters on the arrival side. Please note, however, the landing space is not required if the entrance door is through an appurtenant garage or carport directly into the dwelling. Just to summarize, a 820 minimum clear opening is required, a step-free door threshold, a 1200 by 1200 clear space. In addition, the entrance area must be weatherproofed. Now, based on the last requirement for weatherproofing, let's talk about how the NCC requirements cross over to the livable housing design requirements. It should be noted that where an external step-free level entrance is provided, there are other certain NCC provisions which we'll talk about. For instance, the weatherproofing provisions must still be achieved where an impermeable surface such as hardscaping is provided at the entry. This would require a channel drain across the entire length of the opening, for instance. Please note that this drain must be appropriately sized and designed to comply with the plumbing and stormwater drainage requirements of AS 3500 Part 3, or alternatively be designed in accordance with the drainage provisions applicable by NCC Volume 2, deemed to satisfy Clause H2D2. In addition, depending on how the dwelling access is provided, please note that the weatherproofing provisions do not apply to an entrance door that is provided through an interconnected garage directly to the dwelling. Lastly, to discuss the Livable Housing Design Standard, it does provide an alternative option to satisfy the weatherproofing requirements, and this is through the provision of a roof covering which must be 1200 millimeters by 1200 millimeters and a landing area that is level or has a fall not greater than 1 in 40 at the entry. Please note, however, when using this option, that any posts or columns that support the roof covering to this area, those posts and columns must not encroach into the minimum 1200 by 1200 millimeter landing area required in front of the entrance door. Moving on to the termite management requirements and the specific requirements that relate to the standard. As mentioned previously, for sites identified as requiring termite risk management, and in addition to having a level threshold for the entry access ramp or path required by the Livable Housing Design Standard, it should be noted that those sites that require termite risk management, and in order to check whether termites have breached the gap, the applicable Australian standard AS 3660 Part 1 does require a 25 millimeter inspection gap to allow for clear visual inspection. It should be noted that this method can generally be used when the level entry is protected by a roof over the entry porch, for instance, and this gap can be covered by a removable plate or alternatively integrated into the drainage channel to allow compliance if used with a channel drain, as previously shown. In addition, for those who would like to find out about any other solutions to the termite management in cases where there is no step up into the dwelling, please refer to Australian Standard 3660 Part 1 and the clauses shown on the screen now. So those clauses are 2.2, 2.3, 4.4, and 6.5. They provide for specific construction methods. Now let's move on to our next section, which relates to the inside of the dwelling. We'll start with the clear opening width requirements and then the applicable threshold requirements. Firstly, let's start with the internal doors, which must have a clear opening width of 820 mm clear, as shown on the screen. Please note that this only applies to a doorway that connects to or is in the path of travel to any of the following. The first is the habitable room or laundry on the ground or entry level. Secondly, the attached Class 10A garage or carport that forms part of an access path. And thirdly, any sanitary compartment that is required and subject to the provisions on the ground or entry level that is required to comply. In addition, it should be noted that where the threshold of an internal door that is subject to the provisions is provided, that threshold must be level or have a maximum 5 millimeter lip that is rounded, or alternatively have a ramped threshold that does not extend beyond the depth of the door jamb and have a gradient not steeper than 1 in 8. And lastly, be at least as wide as the minimum clear opening width of the doorway it serves. Moving on to the internal corridors, hallways and the like that are connected to an internal door. These must also comply with the minimum opening widths and also have a clear width of 1 meter measured between the finished surfaces of the opposing walls. Please note, however, that this requirement does not apply to a stairway that is in a path of travel to a shower that is required to comply with the standard, but is on a level other than the ground or entry level of the dwelling. Let's now have a look at the threshold example applicable to an internal doorway. The threshold, as mentioned, must be level, have a height no more than 5 millimeters if the lip is rounded or beveled, or be ramped within the depth of the door frame and have a gradient not more than 1 in 8. Let's move on to our second quiz. So the first question here relates to whether the exemptions from compliance to the dwelling access means that all other standard provisions can be ignored. The second question relates to whether the dwelling entrance door must be at least 820 millimeters clear. And the third question relates to the internal doorways, which must have an opening clear width of 820 mil, and that only applies to a doorway that connects to or is in the path of travel to any of the following examples. So the answer to the first question was false. All other standard requirements must still be complied with. The answer to the second question was true. And the answer to the third question was also true. So well done to all those that got that correct. Moving on to the sanitary compartments and the requirements. The first requirement is that there must be at least one sanitary compartment located on the ground or entry level of a dwelling. And the term sanitary compartment refers to a room or space containing a toilet. It applies equally to any type of room or space containing a toilet, such as a bathroom, ensuite, powder room, or other separate room. A sanitary compartment subject to the standard must be constructed in accordance with the following. Firstly, a toilet pan located in a separate sanitary compartment must have a clear width of not less than 900 millimeters between the finished surfaces of opposing walls either side of a toilet pan. For a room containing a toilet pan, any fixed obstruction such as a basin or a vanity unit must be located at least 450 millimeters from the center line of the toilet pan, measured from the front face of the system. And thirdly, in addition to the clear minimum circulation space of 1200 millimeters by 900 millimeters, this must be provided from the front edge of the toilet pan. So this slide reiterates the requirements on how to firstly correctly apply the standard. So here are examples on how to correctly identify a sanitary compartment. We can see from figure 1A on the left, that is a sanitary compartment. Figure 1B is identified not as a sanitary compartment, and figure 2 we can confirm is a sanitary compartment for the purposes of the standard. In regard to the toilet pan requirements, as shown here, it should be noted that where the required minimum circulation space of 1200 millimeters by 900 millimeter wide clear space is provided in front of the toilet pan, this also applies for both a separate sanitary compartment and for a sanitary compartment that is combined with a bathroom. As mentioned, the minimum circulation space must be clear of the door swing, and it also applies regardless of whether the door is inward opening or outward swinging or is a cavity slider. Here is another example, this time of a bathroom layout that includes the toilet pan. This is also required to meet the step requirements of the standard. The key requirement, once again, is a clear zone of 900 by 1200 immediately in front of the front edge of the toilet pan, as shown by this slide. Now let's move on to discussing the requirements to showers. It should be remembered that at least one shower must comply with the standard, and this means that in a dwelling with 2 or more showers, only one of those showers needs to comply with the requirements. However, having said that, please note that a shower subject to the standard need not be located on the ground or entry level of the dwelling. Please also remember that there is no minimum shower size or minimum clear opening requirement, and the room to the shower must have a minimum door width and must also achieve the threshold requirements regardless. To achieve the requirements, the standard requires the shower to be hobless and to also have a step-free entry and a lip no more than 5 millimeters in height. This requirement is important as it also relates to the National Construction Code provision for a shower to have a lip not more than 5 millimeters in height for a required water stop angle. This is required to meet the objectives of deemed to satisfy clause H4D2. In addition, please note that compliance with Australian Standard 3740, the standard for waterproofing of domestic wet areas, or Part 10.2 of the housing provisions can satisfy the overarching performance requirements as stipulated for wet areas under H4P1 of the NCC. Moving on to Part 6 of the standard, which specifies the requirements for the reinforcement of bathroom and sanitary compartment walls. The intent of these requirements is to ensure that certain walls adjacent to a shower, a toilet, and in some cases a bath can support the future installation of grab rails. Please note that the requirements for reinforcement are provided by the respective NCC governing requirements, which are firstly located within the performance requirements of H8P1 subclause F for volume 2 and G7P1 for volume 1. The deemed to satisfy provisions of H8D2 of volume 2 and G7D2 of volume 1. And in addition, please also refer to the specific construction requirements provided in Part 6 of the Livable Design Standard. Let's watch a small animation video outlining some of those key reinforcement requirements.
Sanitary compartments. A sanitary compartment must be provided at the ground or entry level. It must have a reinforced wall, and the entry must be 820 millimeters and step-free. There must also be a 1,200 millimeters by 900 millimeters circulation space in front of the toilet.
So that video just provides a summary of the requirements. Please note, however, that wall reinforcement is not required if the walls are constructed of concrete, masonry, or other similar like material which is capable of supporting a grab rail. It must be noted that Part 6 reinforcement also only applies to sanitary compartments or bathrooms subject to the requirements of the design standard. For instance, the requirement for a sanitary compartment located on the ground level and the requirements related for a shower. It should also be remembered that if there is no requirement to install the actual grab rail, the reinforcement refers only to the noggings or sheeting, for instance. There are a couple of exemptions regarding reinforcement that should be noted that apply to baths and showers. The first is that reinforcing is only required to the available width of the wall, and in some instances where window encroaches the reinforcement zone and it is not possible to reinforce the back wall, reinforcement such as sheet or noggings can still be installed on the available sidewall, as shown in this example on this slide. This means that a bath with one adjoining wall only requires reinforcement to the one adjoining available wall, for instance. Please note that in addition, any freestanding baths that are proposed are excluded from the standard. There is also no maximum or minimum dimension for the freestanding bath specified within the standard for a distance from the wall. Now let's move on to the reinforcement requirements around toilets. Let's take a look at this short video for an overview.
Reinforcement of bathroom and sanitary compartment walls. Reinforcement can either be sheeting reinforcement or timber noggings. Sheeting reinforcement. Here is a side view of a bath. If sheeting wall reinforcement is used, wall reinforcement construction must be minimum 12 mm thick standard grade plyboard. There must be a minimum of 450 mm of reinforcement horizontally from either side of the center line of the bath, as well as 600 mm of reinforcement vertically from the top of the bath. Here is a view of the bath to the internal corner. There must be a minimum of reinforcement of 225 mm extending horizontally beyond the width of the bath, as well as 900 mm extending vertically from the top of the bath. Timber nogging reinforcement. Here is a view of the bath to the internal corner again. Timber noggings must be a minimum of 25 mm thick and 150 mm wide. The bottom edge of the nogging must be 600 mm above ground level. The top edge of the nogging must be 1,600 mm above ground level. Here's the side view of the bath again. And the nogging. The nogging must be 150 mm wide, and there must be 300 mm of nogging extending horizontally from the center line of the bath. Here is the center line of the nogging. And here's the top of the bath. There must be 175 mm between the top of the bath and the center line of the nogging.
Moving on to our third and final quiz to recap our section. So question 1 relates to whether a clear minimum circulation space of 1200 mm by 900 mm must be provided from the front edge of the toilet pan. So is that true or is that false? The second question relates to the wall reinforcement and whether or not it's required if the walls are constructed of concrete, masonry, or other material capable of supporting a grab rail. So thank you for all of those that have answered. The answer to question 1 is yes, that is true. And the answer to question number 2 is also true. So very well done to those who got that right. So well done for, as mentioned, for all those that answer those questions correctly in each quiz. And to conclude, in this webinar session, we've looked at various applications and examples in how to achieve compliance with the Livable Design Standard. In summary, we hope that we've helped you to obtain a better understanding of the various provisions of the standard.
Okay, thanks, Adam. A lot of great info there, and also an unprecedented amount of questions in the chat, which, from our perspective, it's fantastic to see such a well-attended webinar and so many questions. It just shows how many people are interested and looking to start the discussion on different changes in the industry. So that's really pleasing to see. As I've said before, any of the questions we haven't got to, we will collate some responses and get them out. Another thing I saw in the questions was, will there be a practice note for the VBA? Yes, we're working on that currently. Obviously, it'll be led by a lot of the questions that we've received today. So we'll put that together over the next couple of weeks, and then we sort of circulate that with some of our external working groups to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and we'll get that out to the industry to help guide them. So we'll go to a couple of pre-submitted questions and answer those now. The first one for Adam is, in the case of alterations to an existing building, can consent to partial compliance be applied?
Thanks, Luke. Yep, that's a very good question. So I can summarize by talking about, so whenever there's a change to building regulations, the relevant building surveyor does have the discretion in deciding whether to apply Section 10 of the Building Act. So Section 10 can be used to obtain an exemption from the RBS from having to comply with a new regulation that comes into effect. So Section 10, for instance, can be applied when the building was substantially designed before the new regulations came into effect. So there could be a scenario where the Livable Housing Design Standard, an exemption can be applied, but as I mentioned, it is discretionary, and the RBS needs to be communicated with on whether or not that's allowable. There are a numerous variety of scenarios that can be applied. However, for all those interested in finding out more about Section 10, I would recommend referring to our website and our guidance material available there, and also have a read of Minister's Guideline 13, which steps out the differing scenarios that that Section 10 could be applied to.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adam. And question 2, can this part of the BCA 2022 be subject to Section 10 of the Act when the design has been completed prior to 1st of May 2024?
Yeah, as I've just mentioned, yes,
we talked about that.
Yeah, that's right. We've just spoken about that one. It can be applied. It is discretionary, so the relevant building surveyor needs to be consulted on that matter.
Yep, fantastic. Okay, well, that's the pre-submitted questions. Do you think there's anything else, Adam, that we could cover, or you think we could address at this time, or you think we've wrapped it up and we'll get back to everyone in the next couple of weeks?
I think there's a lot of requirements in Livable Housing Design Standard, and if anyone who's come to the webinar today is keen to know more, feel free to send us your questions. In regards to documentation moving forward on applicable sites, I would say that the onus begins with the registered practitioners who design the plans and architectural documentation. So those practitioners need to turn their mind to making sure their documentation is sufficient in demonstrating compliance with the Livable Housing Design Standard before documentation is submitted to the relevant building surveyor, for instance. So those draftspersons and architects, I recommend taking time to go through those standards and making sure their documentation demonstrates compliance.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess once you get past the design phase, it's hard to sort of, for a surveyor, for example, to help, rectify issues if a ramp was required, for example. So yeah, it's a good point you make that that this really needs to be nailed down at the design phase, so that we're not kind of in a position where we're really struggling to achieve compliance. Good point, Adam.
That's
All right,
right.
mate,
I
well-
think, yeah, I think the onus is on those practitioners to make sure their documentation is up to speed with the livable design standard, and they need to reread and understand those documents before submitting any documentation applicable to a building permit application.
Yep, good point. Good point. We'll make the whole process run a lot smoother if that's the case. So, okay, well, thanks, Adam, and thank you again to everyone for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this session. As I said previously, we'll collate all of the unanswered questions and we'll publish those so everyone can have a look at the Q&As, as well as the practice note that'll be coming out shortly to help guide the industry. We'll soon be sending out an email that includes the webinar survey as well as proof of attendance. And a link to today's webinar and slideshow, so you can rewatch it or go through that slideshow if needed. And to find out when the next Practitioner Education Series webinar will be held, please visit our website in the coming days. Keep an eye out for our emails of further webinars. Thank you all.